It is Valentine's Day, 1981, and 12-year-old Todd Domboski is cutting through his grandmother's yard on East Park Street in Centralia, Pennsylvania. The ground is ordinary under his feet, brown winter grass, a light frost. Then it isn't ground at all. The earth opens without warning. He drops. The hole is 4 feet wide. He falls, grabs at something in the dark, finds exposed tree roots, and holds. The sinkhole beneath him is 150 feet deep. A plume of carbon monoxide is rising from the bottom at concentrations that would kill a man in minutes. His cousin, Eric Wolfgang, arrives, grabs his arms, and pulls him out. That is how close it was. One boy, one tree root, one cousin, near enough to hear him yell. What opened under Todd Domboski's feet was not a freak of geology. It was the result of a fire that had been burning beneath the streets of Centralia for nearly 19 years. A fire that nobody had stopped. A fire that the state of Pennsylvania had spent more than $3 million trying to extinguish and could not. The fire had been moving through the abandoned coal mine tunnels under the town since May 1962, following the oxygen through passages that ran in every direction at depths of up to 300 feet across a network that no map in existence fully showed. Centralia was built on what lay beneath it. The coal seams made it possible. They made it prosperous. They made it for a few decades at the end of the 19th century, one of the most densely productive communities in the anthracite belt of Pennsylvania. And then, because the coal seams were connected underground in ways nobody had ever fully reckoned with, they destroyed it. After the sinkhole, the town had about 1,000 residents and a zip code, and 7 churches, and a bar, and a borough council that met on the first Tuesday of every month. All of that was still true. The sinkhole was also still open. Go back 300 million years. The ground beneath central Pennsylvania is not level. It never was. Over geological time, layers of organic material, the compressed remains of ancient forests, were folded and buckled by tectonic pressure into a formation geologists call the anthracite belt, a band of metamorphic carbon running through the mountains of northeastern Pennsylvania in a series of deep, complex, interlocking seams. Anthracite is not the coal of flat Midwestern fields. It is hard coal, nearly pure carbon, formed under heat and pressure far greater than the bituminous coal found elsewhere. It burns hotter and longer and cleaner than anything else taken from American ground. Pennsylvania holds 95% of all the anthracite in the United States, and for most of the 19th century, that concentration made the anthracite belt the most strategically valuable real estate in North America. The valley that would become Centralia was wilderness until 1749, when Native American tribes sold the land to colonial settlers for 500 pounds. No one was in a hurry to develop it. The Reading Road passed through in 1770, connecting the inland settlements to the Susquehanna River at Fort Augusta. But the coal in the ground went untouched. In 1793, Robert Morris, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and one of the financiers of the American Revolution, purchased roughly a third of the valley. He went bankrupt 5 years later and was sent to debtor's prison without ever having done anything with the land. In 1830, a French sea captain named Stephen Girard purchased Morris's tract at a Philadelphia auction for $30,000, having heard that the hills above the Shamokin Creek held anthracite. He confirmed this was true. Then he also did very little with it. In 1832, a man named Jonathan Faust opened a tavern in the clearing, called it the Bull's Head, and a settlement began to form around it. The actual development of Centralia waited for a mining engineer named Alexander Rea, who arrived in 1842 when the Locust Mountain Coal and Iron Company purchased the land surrounding the tavern. Rea laid out streets and lots with the precision of a man who intended to build something permanent. He named the town Centreville, hoping it would become the commercial center of the region. He changed the name to Centralia when the post office informed him there was already a Centerville in Schuylkill County. What Rhea could not see from the surface was the precise shape of what lay beneath the streets he was drawing. The anthracite seams under the valley ran in formations buckled by ancient pressure, connected underground in ways that no surface survey could reveal. The advantage that would make Centralia was folded into the earth in a pattern that nobody had fully mapped. And nobody would. Not then, not later, not ever. 2,761. That is the number the federal census recorded for Centralia in 1890, in a borough that covered less than a quarter of a square mile, a town smaller in footprint than many city parks. Worth sitting with. The Mine Run Railroad arrived in 1854, and within 2 years, the first commercial mines were operating. Coal production grew through the Civil War years and past them, drawing immigrant labor in waves. The Irish came first, tens of thousands of them. Men from Donegal and Mayo and Clare who had survived the famine and found work in the dark. The work was brutal in a specific way. A miner spent his shift crouched in passages barely tall enough to kneel in. The air thick with coal dust, so fine it felt like breathing chalk, the darkness broken only by a lamp mounted to his cap. The coal dust settled in the lungs over years and decades. Black lung disease was not a risk of the trade. It was the trade's standard outcome for men who survived long enough. Gas pockets could explode without warning. Roof collapses happened without sound. Wages were paid partly in company scrip, redeemable only at company-owned stores, which meant that men who worked the mine could rarely escape the debt the mine created. The Irish miners of Centralia brought something else with them from the old country, a tradition of organized resistance to landlords and mine operators, of secret societies and collective action, and, when those failed, violence. By the 1860s, the town was a center of activity for the Molly Maguires, a clandestine network of Irish-American miners who used intimidation and assassination to contest the power of the operators. Between 1863 and 1867, across the anthracite region, no fewer than 57 murders were attributed to the labor violence of the period. Centralia's founder did not escape it. On October 17, 1868, Alexander Rhea was driving his buggy from the neighboring town of Mount Carmel back to Centralia when he was ambushed, robbed, and killed. 3 men later identified as Molly Maguires were convicted of his murder and hanged in Bloomsburg in March 1878. Rhea never saw Centralia at its peak. He died 6 years before the town reached the population count he had been planning for. By 1890, Centralia had 27 saloons, 5 hotels, 7 churches, 2 theaters, a bank, a post office, 14 general and grocery stores, and at least 14 active coal mines, pulling anthracite from the seams beneath the streets. The air downtown smelled of coal smoke and horse manure and fresh-baked bread from the bakeries that had opened to feed the shift workers. The collieries ran around the clock. You could hear them from every corner of the borough, the constant mechanical grinding of the breakers sorting coal above ground while the men worked below it. This was the fortune. It was real. It was also built on a single resource that ran through seams, no map in existence fully described, in a town whose entire economy depended on what lay directly beneath it. No one in 1890 did this arithmetic out loud. The arithmetic waited. By the turn of the century, anthracite's peak was already behind it. Cheap fuel oil was arriving on the market. The great blast furnaces of Pittsburgh were switching fuels. Demand softened, then fell again after World War I. By 1929, when the Wall Street crash erased what remained of the coal company's balance sheets, the Lehigh Valley Coal Company closed 5 of its Centralia mines in a single year. The population had been falling for a generation. Now, the principal employer pulled out. What happened next shaped everything that followed, though no one understood it at the time. The men who lost their jobs at the Lehigh Valley mines did not leave Centralia. Many of them went back underground on their own, without permits, without safety inspections, without any documentation of where they were digging. This was called bootleg mining, and in the town of Centralia, where nearly all legitimate production had ceased by 1929, it tripled almost immediately. Journalist Louis Adamick, traveling through the anthracite region in 1930, reported the scale of the operations with a kind of dark admiration. The trucks running through the night, the coal moving openly through towns that no longer pretended to supervise it. The bootleg miners developed a particular technique that maximized short-term yield at catastrophic long-term cost. Conventional mine engineering left massive columns of coal in place underground, deliberately, to support the weight of the rock and earth above the tunnels. The columns, called pillars, were the structural skeleton of any mine. Bootleg miners, desperate for coal they could sell, entered the abandoned shafts and pulled the pillars out, extracting every ton they could reach and leaving the tunnels to collapse behind them. This was called pillar robbing, and across the Centralia mine network it produced, over the course of the 1930s, a vast subterranean honeycomb of fractured passages, collapsed voids, undocumented tunnels, and interconnected chambers that no map recorded and no engineer had surveyed. The collapsed areas were riddled with fissures that brought surface air down into the dark. The abandoned workings were, in the language of fire safety, fully oxygenated. In 1950, the Centralia Borough Council made a decision that would look, in retrospect, like a dark joke. Pennsylvania had passed a law enabling municipalities to acquire mineral rights beneath their streets, and the council voted to purchase all the anthracite beneath Centralia. They paid a nominal sum for it. They were acquiring, without knowing it, the fuel for a fire that nobody had yet started. Beneath a town whose mine network had been systematically emptied of the structural supports that might have slowed such a fire down, threaded with undocumented passages that would carry it in directions no engineer could predict, the coal was theirs, every ton of it. The borough had a population of 1,986 that year, down from its 1890 peak of 2,761. By 1960, it had fallen to 1,435. The mining companies had almost all closed. The railroad shut down in 1966. But Centralia was still a functioning town. Schools and parishes, and diners and corner stores, a close-knit community of families who had lived there for generations, who had buried their grandparents in St. Ignatius Cemetery on the southwest edge of town and expected to be buried there themselves. On the evening of May 27, 1962, 5 members of Centralia's volunteer fire company set a fire in a garbage pit. The Memorial Day holiday was approaching. The Borough Council had voted to clean up the town landfill before the holiday, as it did periodically, because the dump was adjacent to the Odd Fellows Cemetery and the smell and the vermin were an embarrassment. The landfill occupied an abandoned strip mine, a pit roughly 75 feet wide and 50 feet deep that had been opened in 1935 and never properly closed. Pennsylvania had passed a law in 1956 specifically prohibiting landfill burns in abandoned strip mines because the risk of igniting underground coal seams was well understood. The law required a non-combustible lining and sealed mine entrances before any burn could proceed. Neither requirement had been met in Centralia's pit. The firefighters piled the trash in the pit and lit it. The trash burned. They hosed down the ashes and went home. 2 days later, the fire reappeared. They extinguished it again. A week after that, on June 4th, it appeared again. The fire company investigated with bulldozers and rakes, moving the ash around, trying to find the hidden source. They found it. In the floor of the pit was a 15-foot opening, an unsealed entrance into the abandoned mine workings below, and the fire had already passed through it. It was underground. The early attempts to fight it were earnest and insufficient. A crew tried covering the burning area with clay. Another tried flushing the tunnels with a slurry of crushed rock and water, but the temperatures froze the water lines. The stone grinding machine broke down, and the supply of slurry ran out before the tunnels were even half filled. The crew went over budget by $20,000 and stopped. Per the official record of the Pennsylvania Center for the Book, in those first weeks and months, An additional commitment of perhaps $10,000 to $20,000 might have been enough to extinguish the fire. That money was not committed. A good deal of state funding was already being spent on mine fires elsewhere in Pennsylvania, and no one could predict how quickly this one would spread, so there was no urgency. Decisions were deferred. Letters were written. A series of small interventions was attempted, each one underfunded and halted before completion. By August 9, 1962, carbon monoxide had been detected in the mine workings near the fire, and all the remaining mines near Centralia were permanently closed. The men who might have fought the fire underground had nowhere to go. The fire moved the way underground fires move, not as a front, not as a wall, but as a slow animal following oxygen. It found the pillar-robbed voids and traveled through them. It found the bootleg tunnels that weren't on any map and followed them. It expanded in multiple directions at once, through passages that surface engineers couldn't see and couldn't seal. The bore holes drilled to monitor it hit pockets of heat and gas and collapsed. The trenches dug to contain it were extended, and then the fire went around them, through voids below the trench line. Between 1962 and 1978, state and federal authorities spent more than $3.3 million in total, and the fire was larger at the end of that period than it had been at the beginning. Most of Centralia's residents knew almost none of this. The Pennsylvania Department of Health was denying to the press that any public health problem existed. Smoke wisped from cracks in the ground in cold weather. There was a sulfur smell in some basements. People kept their windows open and went to work and took their children to school and thought, because officials were telling them this, that the situation was being managed. In 1979, the mayor of Centralia was a man named Joan Quigley, who also ran a gas station on the edge of town. One day in 1979, Coddington pushed a measuring stick down into one of his underground fuel storage tanks to check the level. The stick felt warm when he pulled it up. He lowered a thermometer instead. The gasoline in the tank was reading 172 degrees Fahrenheit. Not quite hot enough to ignite, but gasoline stored underground in a town built over a burning coal seam should not read 172 degrees Fahrenheit. He reported it. The state investigated, confirmed the temperature, and monitored the situation. No evacuation was ordered. No emergency was declared. Another letter was written. By 1980, the population of Centralia had fallen to 1,012, a number that still represented a functioning community, 1,000 people with children and jobs, and church memberships and opinions about the borough council. Among them was a short-order cook named Tom Larkin, a Centralia native who had watched the official response to the fire for nearly 2 decades and had become increasingly furious about what he was seeing. Larkin was the kind of man who believed in making things visible. In 1982, he invited journalists to his yard and cooked an egg in a frying pan set directly on the ground, using the heat rising through the soil from the burning coal below. The egg cooked. The photographers took their pictures. On the other side of the fire debate was Helen Womer, a bank teller who had lived in Centralia most of her life and had spent years lobbying state and federal officials to do something about the situation. Her position was pragmatic: extinguish the fire or relocate the residents, but do not allow 1,000 people to remain indefinitely in a town that was being consumed from underneath. When the state eventually did move toward relocation, Womer reversed course. She and her husband Carl, who would become the borough's last official mayor, refused to leave. They had fought for attention and then decided, when attention arrived in the form of demolition orders, that they would rather stay above the fire than abandon the town they had always lived in. The Valentine's Day sinkhole changed the national calculus. Todd Domboski's near death on February 14th, 1981 was covered by NBC News, ABC, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. For the first time, Centralia was not a local fire department problem or a state agency budget line. It was a boy's face looking down into a 150-foot hole that had opened under him In his grandmother's yard, the United States House of Representatives held hearings. Representative Frank Harrison of Wilkes-Barre began drafting the legislation that would eventually appropriate $42 million to relocate every resident who wanted to leave, an amount that translates to roughly $140 million in current dollars. In 1983, the definitive assessment of what it would cost to actually extinguish the fire was completed. The figure was $663 million, roughly $2.2 billion today, with no guarantee of success. The tunnel network was too large, too fractured, too unmapped. There were too many bootleg holes no one had recorded, too many collapsed passages that ventilated the fire from the surface in ways that defied any sealing effort. A U.S. Bureau of Mines geologist would later tell Smithsonian Magazine that extinguishing the Centralia fire is the impossible dream. Congress looked at $663 million and looked at $42 million and chose $42 million. The cheaper option was to relocate the town. The Centralia Mine Fire Acquisition Relocation Project began in 1984. The process was, on paper, voluntary. The state would buy each property at fair market value plus a relocation allowance, and residents could move to the nearby communities of Mount Carmel, Ashland, and Bloomsburg. Most residents accepted. Over the following years, more than 1,000 people packed their belongings and left. 500 structures were demolished. The street grid remained, but the houses were gone, leaving driveways that ended in gravel fill, stoops that led to empty lots, lawns that no one mowed, growing slowly into scrub. Not everyone left. Tom Larkin left, but Helen and Carl Wimmer stayed in the house on Wood Street a few blocks from the Odd Fellows Cemetery, a few hundred yards from the pit where the fire had entered the earth in 1962. Helen Wimmer, who had spent years demanding that the government act, now told anyone who asked that the danger was being exaggerated. The state, she said, wanted the land. They wanted the coal. Carbon monoxide was detectable in her home, and she maintained this was the government's lie. She died in 2001, having never left. Carl lived on, the borough's last official mayor, and died in 2014 at the age of 90, buried with military honors beside Helen in St. Ignatius Cemetery. When he died, the house reverted to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania under the terms of the 2013 settlement. A handful of other residents also refused to leave after the 1992 eminent domain declaration, in which Governor Robert Casey condemned all remaining properties in Centralia. John Lokitis Jr., whose family had lived in Centralia for generations, was among them. They filed a federal lawsuit, arguing that the state was using safety concerns as a pretext to seize the coal. The litigation ran for 2 decades. In 2013, the Commonwealth settled. 7 remaining residents received a combined payment of $349,500 and were granted life estates, the right to remain in their homes until they died, after which the properties would pass to the state and be demolished. The U.S. Postal Service had already revoked Centralia's zip code, 17927, in 2002. St. Ignatius Catholic Church, the parish the Irish miners had built on the southwest edge of town, held its final Mass in June 1995 and was demolished in November 1997. The school closed, the bars closed, the diner closed. By 1990, the population was 63. By 2020, it was 5. The fire was not shrinking. By the time the last residents were settling their lawsuit in 2013, the Centralia Mine Fire covered an estimated 3,700 acres of underground terrain, burned at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit at depths of up to 300 feet, and was moving through the coal seam at a rate estimated between 50 and 75 feet per year. Geologists have assessed the remaining fuel load and concluded that the fire has enough anthracite left to burn for another 250 years. This is not a projection designed to alarm. It is an estimate based on a straightforward calculation. There is still a very large quantity of burnable coal in the ground, and the fire is burning it. Centralia is still a legal municipality. It has a borough seal and a municipal building, the only structure in town that the Commonwealth does not hold title to. Its population, as of the 2020 census, is 5. The coal seam is still burning beneath the streets those 5 people walk. If you drive to Centralia today, you will find the street grid: Locust Avenue, Park Street, Wood Street, the intersection of Route 61 and 42, the green road signs still marking corners where houses no longer stand. The cemeteries are intact. Oddfellows Cemetery, where the landfill was adjacent in 1962, and St. Ignatius Cemetery beside it, where Joan Quigley, the journalist who would later write the definitive book on the Centralia fire, first glimpsed smoke rising from the earth at age 15 during her grandmother's funeral. The smoke is still rising in places, carbon monoxide vents from ground fissures without any visible warning. The Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection advises against extended contact with the ground in the active vent areas. The stretch of Route 61 that ran through the center of town, rerouted in 1994 because the fire had made the road surface buckle and steam, was abandoned and became famous as Graffiti Highway, a mile of cracked asphalt covered in spray paint that drew a generation of tourists who wanted to stand in a burning ghost town and feel something. In April 2020, during the early weeks of the pandemic, the property owner had it covered with a dirt berm. The graffiti is gone. The highway is gone. The crowds have mostly moved on, looking for the next accessible ruin. The fire is still there, underneath the berm, underneath the dirt, underneath the town. There is a depression in the ground near the Oddfellows Cemetery, on the southwestern edge of what was once Centralia. The pit where the landfill burned in 1962 is still visible, roughly where it always was, a gentle bowl in the hillside. No historical marker names it. No fence surrounds it. Smoke wisps from the edges of it on cold mornings, rising white against the trees. The fire that entered through that hole has now been burning for 63 years. The town that stood above it for a century is gone. The coal that built the town is what the fire is eating now. The same coal that was there before Alexander Rhea arrived to draw the streets. The same seam that the bootleg miners carved into voids in the 1930s. The same resource the Borough Council purchased the rights to in 1950. Still burning, still following the passages, still going where the oxygen goes. The advantage was always conditional. It just took a long time to show how conditional.